The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer as Katie Rodriguez pushed through the emergency department doors at Oak Creek Memorial, the automatic glass whispering shut behind her like a secret. It was 11:02 p.m. on a Tuesday night in Houston, and the ER was that particular kind of chaos that only happened after midnight: 2 vehicle collisions on I-10, a cardiac arrest from a sushi restaurant, an overdose in the waiting room that no one wanted to make eye contact with. She didn't look at any of it. Not yet. She moved through the organized violence of the emergency department with a kind of invisible efficiency that made her practically a ghost, her white sneakers silent on the tile floor, her hands already knowing where they needed to go before her brain had finished the calculation. "Rodriguez, take Trauma Bay 4, the charge nurse called out, not looking up from the assignment board. Nobody ever looked at Katie when they spoke to her. She was the kind of person people addressed without actually seeing, like she was a helpful piece of equipment that had somehow learned to walk. She had been at Oak Creek Memorial for 14 months and 2 weeks. Not that she was counting. She touched the dog tags hidden beneath her scrubs, a reflex so automatic that she didn't even realize she was doing it anymore, and moved toward the trauma bays. Her thermos of black coffee, the same thermos she had carried through her entire shift for the last 847 days, stayed clutched in her left hand. Cold now. She'd forgotten to drink it again. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, checking the crash cart at the entrance to Trauma Bay 4, verifying that the defibrillator pads were exactly where they should be, that the 18-gauge angiocath needles were positioned with their bevels facing up, that the medication tray had fresh epinephrine at 1 mg concentrations. Everything had its place. Everything had its purpose. This was the only part of her life that still made sense. She didn't notice Dr. Sterling watching her from the observation window of Trauma Bay 3, his arms crossed over his chest, his perfectly pressed white coat bearing the insignia of someone who had learned medicine from textbooks instead of from watching people die. He was 38 years old, had inherited money from a family that had made its fortune in oil, and had the particular kind of contempt for people like Katie that only the perpetually comfortable could manufacture. His eyes tracked her movements, the efficient way she arranged supplies, the almost meditative precision of her hand placement, the small nod she gave when the paramedic update came through on the radio, and his jaw tightened. What he saw was a nurse playing surgeon. What he didn't see was someone who had performed emergency field triage under enemy fire in Ramadi, Iraq, in a hospital tent that had shrapnel holes in the canvas and not enough morphine to treat the bleeding. The patient arrived 7 minutes later, a 42-year-old construction worker with blunt force trauma to the chest cavity and a blood pressure that was doing a slow descent toward the floor. Katie moved to the head of the stretcher, her voice dropping to that tone that made people listen without her having to raise her volume at all. "Get me 2 large bore 4s, 500 milliliters of ONEG wide open, and have respiratory standing by." The words came out like commands, not requests, and everyone in the trauma bay moved. Not because she had ordered them, but because something in her voice made it clear that she knew what she was doing. The code lasted 17 minutes. Katie called medication dosages, guided the placement of chest tubes, read the rhythm strips with the kind of fluency that came from seeing too many people almost die. When the patient's blood pressure climbed back above 90, when the oxygen saturation steadied at 96%, when sinus rhythm returned to the monitor screen, the entire trauma bay released a breath they hadn't known they were holding. The construction worker would live. He would walk out of this hospital because a quiet nurse in wrinkled scrubs had recognized the signs of tension pneumothorax in the 3rd second after he arrived, before anyone else had even finished the initial assessment. Dr. Sterling was still standing at the observation window when Katie finished documenting the code and began the methodical process of cleaning up. He had watched the entire thing. He had seen her hands move with the precision of someone trained to make decisions under pressure. He had seen her operate with a kind of calm that only existed in people who had already survived the worst. And what he felt, watching her work, was not respect. What he felt was something cold and dangerous, the recognition that this careful, by-the-book nurse was exactly the kind of person who could destroy everything he had built. The thing that made Dr. Sterling dangerous was not his arrogance, though he had that in abundance. It was his competence. He had spent 15 years building a relationship with Medtronic, the medical supply company that paid him kickback commissions on every inflated billing code that moved through Oak Creek Memorial's system. 14% of the hospital's purchasing budget routed through accounts that no one was supposed to examine too closely, funneling into a private account in the Cayman Islands. It was the kind of thing that worked perfectly as long as no one asked too many questions. And Katie Rodriguez had been asking questions. She had noticed the discrepancies between supply invoices and actual inventory. She had compared Medtronic's billing codes to the equipment that actually showed up in the hospital. She was the kind of nurse who kept meticulous records because meticulous records kept people alive, and that same attention to detail was starting to become a problem. The cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial occupied the basement level and smelled like the particular combination of antiseptic floor cleaner and reheated fish that characterized all hospital food service areas. Katie was standing in line at 2:34 a.m. with a tray that contained cottage cheese, a cup of green tea, and a piece of wheat toast, the kind of meal that was efficient and required no chewing because her jaw had been clenching since the code, when Dr. Sterling walked in with 3 surgical residents trailing behind him like he was the sun and they were planets caught in his gravitational field. He was speaking loudly, the way wealthy people did in public spaces, as if his voice was worth more than everyone else's silence. "I'm telling you, I give her a week," Dr. Sterling was saying, gesturing with his coffee cup. "1 week before Rodriguez walks out of here. She's got that look about her. Too serious. Can't handle the pressure." The surgical residents laughed because they were young and stupid and didn't understand that laughter was a currency that could be spent, and they were spending theirs now on someone who would forget their names within a month. Katie was still standing in line, her hand gripping the edges of her tray, when Dr. Sterling noticed her and his smile widened. He had been waiting for an audience, and now he had one. The cafeteria was full of second-shift nurses on their breaks, of medical students cramming between rotations, of the kind of people who loved a good humiliation when it didn't have to be their own. "Actually, let me put money on it," Dr. Sterling continued, still looking at Katie with that smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Anyone here want to take that bet? I'll give you 3-to-1 odds. $20 says the nurse quits within 7 days. One of the residents pulled out his wallet, and suddenly there was money on the table, literal $20 bills, and suddenly Katie Rodriguez was a proposition, a wager, a source of entertainment for men who had never had to wonder if they were going to make it through the day. The room went dead silent. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind where everyone pretended they weren't watching, but they were all watching, and Katie could feel their eyes like weight on her shoulders. Dr. Sterling was still smiling when he turned to walk away, and his elbow caught the edge of her tray with what looked like an accident, the kind of careless movement that happened when you weren't paying attention. Except he was paying attention. The tray tilted, and then gravity did the rest. Cottage cheese scattered across the tile floor like small white stones, the teacup shattered into pieces, and the wheat toast landed face down with a soft sound that nobody should have been able to hear in a cafeteria full of people. But they did hear it. Everyone heard it. The sound of something breaking, and nobody moving to help pick it up. Katie stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Her hands were still empty, still at the level where they had been holding the tray. Her jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscle beneath her skin looked like it might split. And then she did something that no one expected. She reached down and began picking up the pieces of her broken meal, moving with that same careful, methodical precision that she used during codes, treating the scattered food with the same attention to detail that she gave to everything else in her life. Dr. Sterling was halfway to the exit when she spoke. Her voice was so quiet that people in the cafeteria had to stop pretending to eat in order to hear her. "I've picked up dying men under mortar fire in Ramadi," Katie said, still crouching on the floor, still picking up the pieces of her lunch. 7 of them in one afternoon. Dragged them across concrete while rounds were coming down. Held their intestines in with my hands because there wasn't time for anything else. She stood up, the broken pieces of her meal in her hands, and made eye contact with Dr. Sterling across the full length of the cafeteria. A single tear escaped from her left eye. She wiped it without breaking his gaze, and when she spoke again, her voice was like stone. "Your disrespect doesn't even register." The room didn't just go quiet. The silence became something with weight and presence, something that pressed down on everyone in the cafeteria and made it hard to breathe. Dr. Sterling's mouth opened and then closed. He left. He didn't walk out quickly or slowly. He just left, and nobody would speak of this moment again, except in whispers, except in stories told to people who hadn't been there, except in the small piece of themselves that everyone in that cafeteria would carry forward the moment they realized they had been wrong about who they were standing next to. Katie finished cleaning up the floor and went back to work. Room 347 was at the end of the second-floor corridor, and the man in the bed was elderly, 71 years old, recovering from a stroke that had left his left side weak and his memory fractured like old plaster. He had admitted himself with a name that matched his charts, Admiral Theodore Warren, United States Navy, retired. Katie had been assigned to his care 3 hours earlier, and she had moved through the routine with the invisible efficiency that had become the cornerstone of who she was, checking his medications, adjusting his making sure the monitors were reading correctly, speaking in soft tones that didn't demand anything from him. It was during her 4th check of the evening that she noticed the tattoo on his left forearm. It was faded, the kind of ink that had spent 15 years losing its color to sun and time and the general entropy of the human body. It was a patch insignia, a specific design that meant something to people who knew what it meant, and Katie knew exactly what it meant. The unit patch from Operation Sandstorm, from the covert medical unit that had never officially existed, from a place and time that she had been ordered to erase from every database, from every record, from every public acknowledgement of her own existence. The Admiral's hand reached up slowly, his fingers trembling from the stroke, and he touched the patch on her scrubs. His eyes were confused, searching her face for a recognition that his damaged memory couldn't quite access. "Rodriguez," he said, the word coming out like a question. His fingers moved to the tattoo on his own forearm, tracing the outline like it was a map to somewhere he could no longer find. Katie stood very still. Muscle memory wanted her to respond, to acknowledge the connection, to cross the line between the person she had been and the person she was now. But she had been given explicit orders 15 years ago, after the official operation ended, after the classified designation had been stamped on every document that mentioned her name. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez had been erased. She had been legally discharged under sealed orders. She had been told that if she ever surfaced, if she ever acknowledged her service, if she ever used her real name in connection with her military service, she would be violating the non-disclosure agreement that bound her for the rest of her life. And so she had become someone else. She had become Katie. She had become invisible. She had become a nurse in a hospital in Houston, Texas, and she had learned to keep her head down. She adjusted the Admiral's fur line with steady hands and said nothing. But as she turned to leave the room, she felt something cold grip her chest, the way scars sometimes ache before a storm, the way old wounds can remember pain even after they've healed. She touched the faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, the one piece of her past that she had kept hidden, the one thing she had never erased, and kept walking down the corridor. The floor moved first. Not swayed, moved, like the building itself was breathing wrong, like the earth had decided to shrug. Katie's hands froze mid-inventory, syringes and gauze packets suspended in the air for one impossible second before gravity reasserted itself with violence. The earthquake hit at 2:13 a.m. on a Wednesday. The sound came next, a deep, grinding roar from below that wasn't natural, wasn't anything the human body was built to process. It was the sound of concrete weeping, of steel bones bending, of a structure that had stood for 43 years suddenly remembering it was mortal. Katie's knees buckled. She caught herself against the supply shelf, and then the world tilted sideways. Ceiling tiles crashed down like playing cards. She covered her head, felt the sharp edge of one slice her forearm, warm blood running across her skin. The lights died. For 3 seconds, 3 impossibly long seconds, Oak Creek Memorial was swallowed by absolute darkness. Then the emergency generators kicked in, and everything was bathed in red. Red light. Red everywhere. Like being inside an infected wound. The sprinkler system activated, cold water raining down on her hair, her scrubs, the scattered supply boxes now tumbling across the floor. The backup power hummed to life with a sound like an angry wasp, and the hallway filled with acrid smoke, gas line, her brain registered automatically. Gas rupture. Building compromise. Structural damage on multiple floors. Katie ran. She moved on instinct, older than her nursing license, older than her civilian name. Her body remembered what her mind had spent 15 years trying to forget. This was triage. This was chaos. This was the thing she had trained for in a desert 2,000 miles away, and her hand stopped shaking the moment she accepted that. The corridor was a minefield. Fallen ceiling tiles blocked half the width, jagged and sharp-edged. A patient had fallen from a stretcher. She registered him in a glance, conscious, bleeding from the scalp but stable, and she kept moving. Room 347 was 17 doors down. The Admiral was on the floor, his fur line torn out, his call button somewhere in the darkness. Blood pooled under his shoulder, dark and spreading. Katie knelt beside him, her voice steady as a metronome. "Sir, I need you to stay still. Can you hear me?" His eyes focused on her face with sudden, desperate intensity. Something flickered behind them, recognition, maybe, or the edge of it, some piece of his fractured memory trying to assemble itself. She pressed a 4x4 gauze against his shoulder and applied pressure, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of muscle memory fully awakened. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. "Your nurse is here now. You're safe." She got him back into bed, stabilized his vitals as best she could without full equipment, and moved again. The ER would be worse. The ER was always worse when the walls came down. The emergency department was chaos crystallized into visible form. A support beam had collapsed across the ceiling, bringing half a wall with it. 3 gurneys were trapped beneath the rubble. She registered that in a glance that took less than a second. Patients screaming. The backup generator failing and restarting. Water pouring from ruptured pipes. And in the doorway stood Dr. Sterling, pale as bone, his hands shaking visibly, his mouth open but no sound coming out. He looked at the collapsed beam. He looked at the bleeding patients. He looked at Katie, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had never actually seen suffering before, who had built his entire career on never having to. He froze. Katie didn't waste words. "Step back, doctor." He didn't move. She grabbed him by the shoulder and moved him physically, her grip firm enough that he stumbled backward into the hallway. Then she turned to the nurses still on shift, Rodriguez, Chen, Martinez, faces she had worked alongside for 2 years and barely knew. "You," she said to Rodriguez, "start moving yellows to the parking lot now. Every ambulatory patient, get them outside, away from the building. You move fast, you move quiet, you move now." "Yes." The word was automatic, but Katie heard it. Heard the shift in her own voice. The civilian nurse was still there, Katie, but underneath her, deeper down, was something else. Someone else. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez, who had filed evacuation routes for 17 people under fire, who knew how to move bodies and save lives and keep her hands from shaking. "You," she said to Chen, "portable oxygen. Every tank on this floor. Get them to the parking lot and start setting up triage stations. I need a clear area where we can." An alarm cut through her voice. The continuous wail of a cardiac monitor flatlined. The 17-year-old girl on the far gurney, Jessica, Katie's brain supplied, remembering from the chart she'd pulled 2 hours ago, was blue-lipped and motionless. Her chest wasn't moving. Her monitor showed asystole, flatline, nothing, the most honest sound a heart monitor could make. Katie was moving toward her before the alarm's second wail finished sounding. "Martinez, get me light here. Any light you can find." The girl's neck, Katie's hands moved to it, fingers finding pulse points with practiced precision. Nothing at the carotid. Nothing at the temporal. The pupils were dilating, that telltale sign that the brain wasn't getting oxygen. Katie's hands moved to the chest, feeling for the problem she already knew was there. The chest wall was rigid on the left side. The abdomen was distended. Cardiac tamponade. Pericardium filling with blood. The heart drowning in its own fluid, unable to pump, unable to do the one thing it had been born to do. Without intervention, Jessica had maybe 3 minutes before permanent brain damage. Maybe 4 before she became a code nobody could restart. "I need a spinal needle, 14-gauge minimum, and I need it now," Katie said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. "Katie, you can't," Martinez started, but Katie was already turning to him, and whatever he saw in her face made him stop talking and start moving. "Where's a needle? Point." He pointed. Katie moved. Her hands found the needle tray, found the alcohol prep pads, found everything she would need to thread the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the exact location where a needle could penetrate the pericardium and let the fluid drain. She turned back to Jessica. The girl's eyes were rolling back now, consciousness slipping. Katie's hand steadied on the chest wall, finding the space between the second ribs with the certainty of someone who had done this before, in a dust storm near Ramadi, with mortar fire walking closer with each explosion. "Hold her still. Katie, we don't have permission, we don't have. Hold her still." The needle was ice-cold in her hand. She could feel the backplane of the chest wall, the anatomical landmarks more real than any textbook description. Her hand moved, and the needle slid home. The give came at the right point, the pericardium finally releasing, weeks of fluid pressure finally finding an exit. The hiss came next, the sound of air escaping, pressure releasing, the sound of salvation. Jessica's monitor began to change. The rhythm came back, slow at first, then faster. A perfusing rhythm. Blood being pumped again. "O2, Katie said quietly. "Get her on high flow. Get her 2 4s, 18-gauge minimum. Type and cross her, assume internal bleeding until proven otherwise. When the ambulance arrives, she goes first." Martinez was staring at her. Chen had stopped moving. Rodriguez had paused at the doorway. Katie didn't look at any of them. She was already moving, already triaging, already doing the work that nobody else in this ER seemed capable of doing. Yellow tags for stable. Red tags for critical. She moved through the chaos of Oak Creek Memorial the way a ghost moves through walls, present but separate, efficient and utterly alone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that as she worked, she could feel the weight of that faded unit patch in her jacket lining, pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat, like a piece of her past that had been buried deep enough to stop breathing. And now, in the red emergency light of a collapsed building, with her hand steady and her voice commanding and her entire buried self finally surfaced, Katie Rodriguez understood something that made the blood in her veins run colder than the sprinkler water in her hair. She was about to be noticed. She was about to be visible. And there was no way to hide anymore. The earthquake had killed visibility. The earthquake had pulled her out of the shadows and into the red light, and Dr. Sterling was going to make 17 phone calls before dawn, and nobody was going to forget what they'd seen her do, and the Admiral in room 347 was going to finally connect the tattoo on his arm to the name on her badge, and nothing was ever going to be quiet again. The spinal needle. 22 gauge. Not the tool she would have chosen, but the crash cart was half buried under drywall and there was no time to excavate it. Katie's fingers found the needle in the emergency supply kit, smaller than ideal, wrong angle for standard procedure, but in Ramadi she had saved a Marine's life with a 14-gauge for catheter and prayer. This was the same calculus. The girl was coding. Cardiac tamponade didn't care about proper equipment. She turned back to the teenager on the stretcher, maybe 16, skin the color of wet concrete, lips already taking on that bluish tint that meant minutes, not hours. The monitors showed the pathognomonic sign, electrical alternans, the QRS complex shrinking and swelling like the heart was drowning in its own pericardial fluid. The girl had been 3 floors down when the ceiling came down. Blunt trauma to the chest. The sound of her heart had already changed, that muffled distant quality that told Katie the pericardial sac was filling, compressing, killing. Dr. Sterling's hand locked around Katie's wrist. His grip was hard, trembling with panic or rage, she couldn't tell. "You can't do a pericardiocentesis without ultrasound guidance," he said. His voice had risen 3 octaves from his normal condescending drawl. "Without proper equipment. You'll kill her." Katie's eyes didn't leave the monitor. "She's already dead if I don't." She didn't pull away. Didn't make it a confrontation. She simply turned her wrist slightly, enough that his grip became uncomfortable, and he released her like he'd touched hot metal. Around them the hospital was coming apart, another aftershock sent a light fixture swaying, and somewhere in the wreckage above, someone was screaming. The ventilators had gone silent when the power failed. The monitors were running on battery backup, their beeps thin and urgent like electronic birds announcing the apocalypse. Katie's hands moved. Muscle memory took over. Count the ribs. Find the landmark. The way they taught her at Camp Lejeune when there was no ultrasound, no time, no backup, just a bleeding teenager in the back of a Humvee with a sucking chest wound and her hand steady because panic killed faster than trauma. She positioned the spinal needle at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, angled it at 45 degrees toward the heart. The girl's respirations were barely visible now, agonal gasps, the sound of a body shutting down. The needle advanced. 1 centimeter. 2. She felt resistance from the ribs, the slight friction of tissue. The pericardium was thicker than she expected, or maybe she was imagining that. Shock did things to perception, made time move like honey. 3 centimeters in. 4. And then the subtle give, that barely there sensation of piercing membrane, and she withdrew the plunger slightly. Dark blood filled the syringe. Dark venous blood, not bright arterial red. She was in the pericardial space, not the heart itself. Exactly where she needed to be. She began draining. Slow, steady, careful, too fast, and the sudden pressure relief could cause cardiovascular collapse. The first 10 milliliters came out like relief itself, and the girl gasped, her eyes flying open, and Katie was already talking, her voice the calm register of someone who had done this 100 times in hospitals made of sandbags and prayer. "You're okay, you're stable, I'm draining fluid from around your heart, you're going to feel better in 10 seconds. The color was coming back to the girl's face already, that gray-blue transforming into human pink. The monitor showed the electrical alternance smoothing out, the QRS complex stabilizing into something that resembled a functional rhythm. 72 beats per minute. Sinus rhythm. The girl's oxygen saturation climbing, 88, now 91, now 95. Katie withdrew the needle, applied pressure with gauze, and looked at the teenager. Really looked at her. 14, maybe 15. The kind of age where you still believed the world made sense. "What's your name?" Katie asked. "Emma," the girl whispered. "Is my mom?" "She's safe. We're moving everyone. You're going to be fine." Katie was already moving, already prepping another needle, and 4-line, running fluids wide open because the next danger was hypovolemic shock. Around them the floor was littered with debris, shattered monitors, papers scattered like snow, someone's stethoscope hanging from a hook like an accusation. The fluorescent lights above had stopped their familiar hum, replaced now by the eerie silence of power failure and the distant sound of sirens, the sound of the city understanding it was broken. Dr. Sterling stood frozen, watching her work. His hands hung at his sides like he didn't remember they were attached to him. Katie didn't have time for his processing. She had 4 more patients who needed evacuation, and the stairwells were already filling with smoke from somewhere deep in the hospital's infrastructure. She assigned 2 nurses to stay with Emma, secured the 4, and turned to the other survivors waiting in the emergency department, a man with a crush injury to his left leg, a woman with a basilar skull fracture, an elderly patient who hadn't spoken since the collapse. Katie did a rapid triage, marked them with tape, yellow, yellow, red, and began moving. The stairwell was darker than the ER, lit only by emergency strips that cast everything in bilious green. Smoke drifted up from below, carrying the smell of burning insulation and ozone. Katie took the crush injury first, a 40-something man named Robert who weighed maybe 200 pounds. She supported his good side, and they went down 1 step at a time, his weight shifting against her with each descent. Her left knee, the one that still complained about the IED blast in Sanjin Valley 8 years ago, screamed with each impact, bone-deep pain that was just information, just data, irrelevant. For flights down. 5. 6. The air got thicker, hotter. Robert was breathing like a man drowning in smoke. By the time they reached the ground floor, Katie's vision was blurring from the smoke, but her body knew the way. Muscle memory was stronger than sensory input. She handed Robert to a waiting paramedic and turned back toward the stairs without a word. The paramedic called after her, "That's a restricted area," but Katie was already climbing again, already moving like she'd done this in Ramadi, in Sanjin, in every place where the world decided to collapse and the only thing standing between survival and death was the person willing to move through the wreckage. 3 more trips. Basilar skull fracture patient. Elderly woman with a fractured hip. A nurse named Derek who had been trapped under a supply cabinet and had a compound fracture of his tibia. Each trip down the smoke-filled stairwell, Katie's movements became more precise, more economical, as if her body was shedding every unnecessary motion. Her voice, when she spoke to the injured, carried the absolute authority of someone who had already made 100 life-and-death decisions before breakfast. "We're moving. Lean on me. Watch the step. 1 foot. Next foot. You're doing great." Not suggestions. Commands. And the patients obeyed because her confidence was contagious, because the timid nurse they might have dismissed earlier was gone, replaced by something harder, clearer, made of surgical steel and old scars. By hour 3, Katie was coordinating the evacuation from the ER entrance itself, directing the flow of patients and staff, assigning roles, eliminating panic through sheer force of will. A nurse was standing paralyzed by shock. Katie moved her to intake registration, gave her one job, write names. A doctor was hyperventilating. Katie put him on supply inventory, gave his hand something to do. A volunteer was crying. Katie looked at him, made eye contact for exactly 2 seconds, and said, "I need you here. Can you do that?" He nodded and took his place in the chain. The evacuation became systematic. Not panicked. Not chaotic. Efficient. The way combat triage worked when the alternative was people dying in the dark. By dawn, the hospital was empty. The morning light came over Houston like judgment, revealing the true extent of the damage, the collapsed East Wing, the fire that had burned through the 3rd floor, the structural damage that would take months to repair. Katie was leaning against the outside wall of the main entrance, covered in dust and blood that wasn't hers, her bad knee swelling up to twice its normal size, her hands trembling with the adrenaline crash that came after 6 hours of running on pure operational necessity. She had saved 11 people. Maybe more. Some of the patients she'd pulled from the rubble might not have made it anyway, might have died in the hours after she'd handed them to paramedics, but that wasn't her calculation. Her calculation was simple: she had moved, and they had lived. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that everyone had seen her do it. Dr. Sterling had watched from the administrative wing, had seen the timid nurse transform into something else, something that looked like she knew exactly what she was doing. And he was already picking up his phone, already making the first of the calls that would come in rapid succession, to board members, to insurance investigators, to lawyers who specialized in destroying people like her. Katie could feel it coming the way she could feel weather changes in her old wounds. The earthquake had pulled her out of the shadows, and Dr. Sterling was going to spend the next 18 hours building a case against her, constructing a narrative of reckless practice and forged credentials, turning her heroism into evidence of criminal negligence. She didn't know it yet, but by this time tomorrow, she would be suspended. Her badge would be gone. Her locker would be cleared. And she would be standing alone at Marcus's grave in the rain, whispering apologies to a man who had asked her to keep her head down, to stay invisible, to survive quietly. But for now, she just breathed. And around her, the city began the slow work of recovery. The sunrise caught the dust in the air and turned it into something that looked almost like redemption. Within 18 hours of the earthquake, the hospital director sits across from Katie in his office with the blinds drawn and his eyes fixed on the desk calendar between them. He won't look at her face. His hands shuffle papers with the careful precision of someone performing a ritual he finds distasteful. The air conditioning hums, cold and mechanical, and Katie can smell the coffee he drank this morning still lingering in the fabric of his suit jacket. He clears his throat twice before speaking. "You're suspended pending investigation," he says flatly. "Unauthorized procedures. Credential verification. Multiple violations of hospital protocol." His jaw works like he's chewing something bitter. The board has no choice. Katie's hands rest on her thighs, steady as stone. "I saved 11 people." The director's eyes finally lift to meet hers, and there's something broken in them, not cruelty, but capitulation. Dr. Sterling has documented 17 protocol violations. He's made calls to the board, our insurance carrier, the state licensing board. He has documentation. The director leans back in his chair. "Your badge and ID. Please." She doesn't hesitate. She reaches up, removes the laminated badge from her scrubs, and places it on the desk between them. It clatters against the wood, a small sound that fills the entire room. Katie watches the director's face, watching him not watch her, and understands with perfect clarity that Dr. Sterling didn't just make accusations, he constructed a narrative. Methodical. Deliberate. Strategic. 23 phone calls. She'll find out later. 23 conversations with board members whose portfolios depend on hospital liability insurance staying low. Conversations with donors whose tax-deductible contributions require the hospital's reputation to remain pristine. A call to an insurance investigator framing her emergency procedures as the desperate improvisation of someone operating outside her credentials. A conversation with a lawyer describing a liability nightmare and an authorized nurse performing critical procedures during chaos, no proper documentation, no supervision, no institutional protection if something had gone wrong. Dr. Sterling had weaponized the hospital's entire administrative and legal architecture against her, turning the very systems designed to protect patients into instruments of destruction. Security escorts her through the corridors at 10:30 in the morning. 2 uniformed officers, one on each side, walking her toward the exit like she's a threat. Her locker has already been cleared, someone has packed her personal items into a cardboard box that sits in the break room looking small and pathetic under the fluorescent lights. A stethoscope she bought her first year working. A photo of Marcus in his SEAL dress uniform. A coffee mug that says "World's Okayest Nurse" that one of the residents gave her as a joke. She carries the box past the trauma bay where she performed the pericardiocentesis, past the supply closet where she learned to catalog medications by their 4 concentrations, past the nurses' station where 3 nurses suddenly become very focused on their computer screens. She doesn't look at them. She's done that already, spent 5 years perfecting the art of disappearing in plain sight, of being invisible, of letting people see what they expected to see and nothing more. But now the invisibility is permanent. Now she's not quiet Katie the efficient nurse. She's Katie the credential fraud. Katie the protocol violator. Katie the one who played hero and burned it all down. Dr. Sterling watches from his office window on the 2nd floor. She sees him as she walks toward the parking lot. Arms crossed. A smile on his face like thin ice on dark water. His won. His eliminated the threat, the careful, competent nurse who noticed things, who asked questions, who moved through his kickback scheme with the precision of someone who could eventually trace the pattern of inflated billing codes back to his office. She was never a coworker to him. She was a liability with a stethoscope. The security officers don't speak to her as they walk. Nobody speaks. The air feels thickened with something Katie recognizes from Ramadi, the static that comes before everything falls apart. She's felt this before in convoy vehicles rolling toward ambush points, that particular silence that means everyone knows something terrible is about to happen and nobody has the authority to stop it. That evening, Katie drives north through Houston traffic toward Pinewood Cemetery. The sky is the color of bruised concrete, and by the time she reaches the gates, cold rain has begun falling in sheets that obscure the world beyond the windshield. She parks and walks without an umbrella, letting the rain soak through her jacket, soaking her hair until it clings to her face. She knows exactly where he is buried. She's memorized the path, Section C, Row 12, Plot 4. 37 graves to the left of the stone angel, 22 graves to the right of the veteran's marker. The headstone is white marble, simple and elegant, the way Marcus would have wanted it. No flags. No flourishes. Just his name, his dates, and the single word seal beneath his rank. She kneels in the mud. The rain comes harder, drumming on her shoulders, and her voice when she speaks is barely above a whisper. I promised you, she says. I promised I'd keep my head down. That I'd stay hidden like they ordered after Sandstorm was buried. They erased me, Marcus. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez doesn't exist anymore, officially. I was never there, never saved anyone, never earned anything. The Pentagon buried the operation. They buried the unit. They buried me. She touches the cold stone. And I kept that promise for 5 years. 5 years of saying nothing. Of being invisible. Of watching incompetent doctors and predatory administrators, and I said nothing because I was supposed to disappear. Her voice cracks like old leather. But I couldn't do it. When that girl was coding on the table, when the boy's heart was filling with his own blood, I couldn't just watch her die. I couldn't be nobody while people were dying. And now I've lost everything again. She's crying now, the rain mixing with tears so completely that she can't tell where one ends and the other begins. He activated his whole network. Board members. Investigators. Lawyers. Everything I was trying to hide, he weaponized against me. I'm done, Marcus. They're going to pull my license. I'm going to be unemployable. Everything I've done since I came home, everything I've tried to rebuild, it's gone. She sits there until the rain stops, until the sun disappears completely behind the Houston skyline, until the cemetery becomes nothing but shadows and silence. A woman kneeling at a grave in the dark, holding something that can't be held anymore. Nobody sees her. Nobody would recognize her as anything significant. She's just another person grieving in the cemetery. Just another story that the world will never know. The next morning, Katie's car is loaded with boxes. Everything that constituted a life at Oak Creek Memorial fits into the trunk of a 2014 Subaru. Her scrubs, her personal items, her badge holder that no longer contains a badge. She's parked in the employee lot, and she's closing the trunk when she hears it, a sound that belongs in deserts and war zones but not in a hospital parking lot in Houston. A deep, rhythmic thumping. The distinctive thump-thump-thump-thump of rotor blades cutting through morning air. Katie freezes. Her body recognizes that sound before her mind can process it. UH-60M Black Hawk. Military specification. The kind of helicopter that doesn't appear in hospital parking lots without explicit authorization and strategic purpose. She looks up. The aircraft descends toward the front lawn of Oak Creek Memorial with the precision of surgical placement. Rotor wash scatters leaves and papers and flower petals from the landscaping like violence, like the ground itself is being shaken apart. The downwash is so powerful that visitors standing near the entrance shield their faces. 2 black SUVs screech to a halt at the main entrance. Car doors slam in unison. A formation of 8 sailors in dress whites marches through the automatic doors with the kind of synchronized precision that only comes from thousands of hours of drilling. Their boots strike the tile in perfect rhythm. 1 2 3 4. 1 2 3 4. The sound stops every conversation in the lobby. Visitors turn. Staff members turn. The entire hospital seems to hold its breath. A Navy captain in service dress blues approaches the security desk. His shoulders are broad as a doorway, his ribbons a vertical tapestry of deployments and commendations. His voice when he speaks carries the weight of authority that doesn't need to be questioned. "We're here for Senior Chief Rodriguez," he says. The security guard behind the desk stammers. "We don't have anyone by that." The captain's voice cuts across the protest like a blade. "Catherine Rodriguez." She was employed here until yesterday. Find her. Now. Katie's hands go still on the trunk of her car. Every instinct screams run. Every combat reflex she trained for 16 years is activated at once, flooding her system with adrenaline, with the tactical assessment of distance and exit vectors. But she doesn't run. She can't run anymore. She's been running her entire life, from Ramadi, from her identity, from her own reflection in bathroom mirrors. Then the Admiral walks out through the automatic doors. He moves slowly, his gait careful but deliberate, his stroke recovery clearly still in process. But he's standing upright in his Navy uniform, and his eyes are sharp and clear and focused. He's flanked by 2 officers, and in his right hand, he holds something small. Something faded. Something that doesn't belong in the clean, fluorescent-lit world of a hospital lobby. A unit patch. Dark green. A red cross with no official designation. The kind of insignia that exists only in classified documents and the memories of people who were ordered never to discuss it. The patch of a medical unit that wasn't supposed to exist. A unit that performed triage in a desert 15 years ago. Someone found this, the Admiral says, his voice carrying across the parking lot, across the entrance, reaching Katie where she stands frozen beside her car. This was sewn inside the lining of a jacket left in the earthquake chaos. Found it during recovery and rescue operations. He holds the patch higher. This patch belonged to a covert medical unit. This patch belonged to Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez. The crowd of staff and patients gathering outside goes completely silent. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind of silence that changes things. The thump came first. That unmistakable percussion of rotor blades, the sound that had pulled her awake in forward operating bases for a decade, a Black Hawk helicopter descending through Houston's humid afternoon sky. Katie froze with a box balanced against her chest, watching the aircraft settle onto the front lawn of Oak Creek Memorial like a predator landing on prey. The rotor wash flattened the grass in concentric circles. Loose papers from the parking lot spiraled upward and scattered across the pavement. She didn't move. Couldn't move. Her hands tightened on the cardboard edges. 2 black SUVs screeched around the corner of the hospital's main entrance, tires screaming against asphalt. Doors opened in synchronized motion. 8 sailors emerged in dress whites, their movements carrying the particular precision of ceremonial units, every step deliberate, every posture radioed into muscle memory. They walked through the automatic doors of Oak Creek Memorial like an honor guard advancing on a fallen comrade. Inside, their voices cut through the ambient hospital noise with the clarity of a command, "We're looking for Senior Chief Rodriguez. Now." The parking lot went quiet. A news crew, still filming the earthquake aftermath 2 blocks away, suddenly swung their camera toward the helicopter. The Admiral from room 347 walked out through those same automatic doors. He wore his uniform for the first time since his stroke, dress blues pressed sharp enough to shave with, insignia gleaming. His gait was still unsteady, the stroke had taken something from his coordination, but he moved with the weight of command despite the hesitation. Officers flanked him on both sides. Behind them, held in a Navy captain's hands, was something small and weathered, a patch, faded to the color of sand and old blood, sewn into a scrap of black fabric. The unit insignia was barely visible, a phoenix rising, a medical cross, and numbers that meant nothing to anyone in this parking lot except 3 people who had carried that patch through Ramadi. Katie's breath caught. She knew exactly what he was holding. Katie Rodriguez. The Admiral's voice carried across the parking lot like he was addressing 1,000 Marines. Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez. Every head turned. Cameras swung. The news crew abandoned their earthquake coverage and ran toward the sound of authority. "This woman is Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Rodriguez," the Admiral announced, his eyes locked on hers with the intensity of someone whose memory had just returned whole. Navy Cross recipient. Combat medic. She performed field triage under enemy fire in Ramadi and saved 47 lives including mine when our convoy was ambushed by insurgent forces. 15 years ago, she dragged me half a mile through fire to an evacuation point while taking shrapnel herself. I had her name tattooed on my arm so I'd never forget." He held up his forearm. The faded letters read, "Rodriguez." My stroke took my short-term memory. But seeing her yesterday, it brought everything back. Katie's box hit the asphalt. The cardboard crumpled. Patient records spilled across the parking lot like confetti. A Navy SEAL commander stepped forward. He was younger than the Admiral but carried himself like violence wrapped in dress whites, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. His voice pitched lower than the Admiral's but reached farther, the way trained warriors could project authority without volume. Senior Chief Rodriguez holds 3 Bronze Stars with Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Distinguished Service Medal for classified operations conducted in direct support of JSOC task force missions. She was honorably discharged under sealed orders after being wounded while saving her entire team from a compromised position. Anyone who disrespected her disrespected the entire United States Navy. He placed emphasis on each medal like he was laying flowers at a grave. The officers beside him stood absolutely motionless. Dr. Sterling never made it back to his office. A Navy captain in service dress intercepted him at the entrance, flanked by 2 federal agents in dark suits that looked expensive and temporary. One of them held a folder the color of institutional beige. "Dr. Richard Sterling," the captain asked. "Not a question." "A statement with a question mark." Sterling's face did something complicated, a smile that evaporated mid-formation. "I'm very busy at the moment." "You are," the captain agreed. "But not in the way you think." The agent opened the folder. Inside were invoices, billing codes, wire transfer records printed in timestamp precision. MedSupply Solutions. You've been purchasing inventory at 40% above market rate and reselling the difference through an offshore account registered to your wife's maiden name. 17 months. $432,000. Sterling's jaw tightened. His hand moved toward his badge, then stopped, falling back to his side like a puppet with cut strings. "I don't know anything about." "The board reviewed our findings," the hospital CEO said. She walked out through the automatic doors like she was walking to her own execution, pale and moving as if gravity had just increased. Her voice shook. "Dr. Sterling, you are terminated effective immediately for insurance fraud, falsifying records, and illegal kickback schemes with medical suppliers. Security will escort you out." The security officers, 2 of them, broad-shouldered and trained to execute this exact motion hundreds of times, took his arms. Not roughly. Not gently. With the professional neutrality of people who had learned to remove obstacles without becoming the story. They walked him toward the parking lot as news cameras swung around like predators catching the scent of blood. Sterling tried once to turn back, to shout something at the assembled crowd, at Katie, at the Admiral, but the agent's hand on his elbow kept him moving forward. The handcuffs came out smooth and quick. The clicking sound they made was like a vault door closing on a life. Every local news channel captured it, the moment Dr. Sterling's face crumbled, the way his hand shook as security took his badge, the perp walked through the parking lot with federal agents at both shoulders. The news broadcasts that night led with, "Hospital Chief of Surgery arrested after fraud investigation triggered by Navy search for decorated combat medic." Katie stood in the parking lot surrounded by sailors in dress whites, surrounded by ceremony and vindication and the violent reversal of 18 hours of professional annihilation. Her voice wouldn't work. She opened her mouth and nothing emerged except something that might have been a breath. The Admiral walked toward her. His stride was still uncertain, the stroke had stolen some fluency from his movement, but his eyes were clear and focused in a way they hadn't been for weeks. He reached up and pulled back his sleeve, showing the tattoo on his forearm. The letters weren't perfect. The lines had blurred with age. But they said her name. "You carried me," he said quietly. "Half a mile through enemy fire. Through smoke and muzzle flashes and dust so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. You carried me because Ramadi taught you what the hospital forgot, that people matter more than protocols. That a senior chief's first duty is to the person in front of her, not the regulations around her. Katie's voice came back, but it broke like old wood. I was ordered to disappear, sir. To never, to erase. You didn't disappear, the SEAL commander said. He had come to stand beside her, the kind of quiet presence that filled space without demanding attention. You came back into the light the moment you saved those people in the earthquake. You've always come back. That's what senior chiefs do. The sun was setting over Houston, painting the sky the color of brass and old blood. The rotor blades of the Black Hawk still turned, waiting. The Admiral extended his hand to Katie. Not a greeting. A salute in slow motion. She took it, and the sailors around her snapped to attention, a gesture of honor rendered to someone who had earned it in the places that matter, the places where medals are awarded in fields under mortar fire. 2 years later, Katie Rodriguez stood in her office on the 3rd floor of Oak Creek Memorial's new Veteran Care Center, a wing funded by private donors and Navy advocacy groups after her story went national. The title on her door read, Director of Combat Veteran Medical Services. On the wall behind her desk hung a framed photograph from the earthquake aftermath, her silhouette carrying a patient down 6 flights of burning stairs, backlit by emergency lights, taken by a news photographer who never knew he'd captured something sacred, a ghost coming back to life. Below it, in a shadow box, lay her Navy Cross, 3 bronze stars, 2 Purple Hearts, the Distinguished Service Medal. The unit patch hung centered, the phoenix rising, no longer hidden. Across town, in a strip mall storefront that smelled of industrial bleach and fluorescent desperation, Dr. Richard Sterling taught CPR certification courses for $13 an hour to teenagers fulfilling high school requirements. He demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic torso that had no heartbeat, would never have a heartbeat, while students scrolled through their phones. One of them was watching a video, Katie Rodriguez speaking at a VA hospital about veteran healthcare access. Sterling saw the screen and looked away. He always looked away now. On Saturday morning, Katie visited Pinewood Cemetery. She knelt at Marcus's headstone in the pre-dawn stillness. Fresh flowers rested against the marble, white lilies and star jasmine, picked from the garden they'd planted together 15 years ago. Her voice was steady this time, no tremor, no apology. I kept it as long as I could, love. But you married a senior chief, not a ghost. You would have understood. She stood, touched the stone once more, and walked back to her car with the kind of peace that only comes after everything has been taken and given back. Listen, if you've got someone in your life who's been underestimated, who's been pushed down and kept silent, share this story. Let them know the truth. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors who change the world when nobody's watching. Like if you believe in honoring hidden strength. And comment, what would you do if the person everyone dismissed turned out to be the person who saved them all?